President Trump with Peter Navarro, right, in the Oval Office last January. Doug MillsThe New York Times, Washington. A fight over President Trump's trade agenda is playing out in the White House as top advisors spar over how far the United States should go in implementing the America First trade policies the president has promised to enact. On one side are Peter Navarro, a trade skeptic tapped by Mr. Trump to run the newly created Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy, and Robert Lighthizer, the United States trade representative leading negotiations to revise the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. On the other side are more moderate voices, including Gary Cohn, head of the National Economic Council, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, Chief of Staff John F. Kelly, and the National Security Advisor, Lt. Gen. H.R. McMaster. Tensions over the direction of White House trade policy have risen in recent weeks, with the growing possibility that the nearly 25-year-old NAFTA agreement will crumble entirely. Mr. Navarro came to the White House with multiple trade actions written and ready for the president's signature. Designed to fulfill the president's campaign promises, they included a directive to begin withdrawing from NAFTA, which Mr. Trump has frequently maligned as the worst deal in history. Mr. Navarro's initial attempt to leave NAFTA was blocked by Mr. Cohn, according to interviews with current and former government officials and others familiar with the deliberations who declined to be named because they were not authorized to speak publicly. Two subsequent attempts by Mr. Navarro to trigger the NAFTA withdrawal process were also stopped by Mr. Cohn. Mr. Navarro has had some success. He drafted the presidential memorandum to officially withdraw the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, an Obama-era trade deal, which the president signed on his fourth day in office. That pact, which would have set new terms for trade and business investment among the United States and 11 other Pacific Rim nations, was criticized by Mr. Trump as ridiculous, but the pro-trade bloc has thwarted Mr. Navarro on multiple occasions. Throughout the spring and summer, Mr. Navarro pushed the White House to impose tariffs on steel imports and to withdraw from the free trade agreement with South Korea. Both efforts were blocked. Late last month, Mr. Kelly called Mr. Navarro into a meeting with Mr. Cohn and told Mr. Navarro his entire operation would be shifted into the National Economic Council. Mr. Navarro now reports to Mr. Cohn, a former Goldman Sachs executive, and is required to copy Mr. Cohn on all emails, according to two of the officials. The personnel clash mirrors a larger dispute inside and outside the White House over the path of American trade policy in an era of globalization, where capital and jobs can move freely across borders. One of the pillars of Mr. Trump's candidacy was his call for remaking the trading system by ripping up existing deals and imposing hefty tariffs to protect American workers. But talking tough on trade has proved easier than enacting policies that would disrupt the global rules that businesses and economies have been built around. Mr. Cohn, along with frequent allies like Mr. Mnuchin and Mr. Kelly, has argued that abandoning trade pacts and raising tariffs would hurt American businesses, the economy and relations abroad. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin left with Gary Cohn, the chief White House economic advisor, on Capitol Hill last month. Al Drago for the New York Times, a White House spokeswoman, said that Mr. Navarro's office had been folded into the National Economic Council as part of an effort to streamline protocols in the West Wing. Since then, the size and scope of his role had remained unchanged, she said. "I'm a chain-of-command guy and will follow Chief Kelly's orders," Mr. Navarro said in a public statement in late September after his office was shifted. "The chief has assured me I will continue to have the same seat and voice at the president's decision-making table." Mr. Navarro does remain an influential voice with the president on China, the topic of several of his books. He recently attended briefings with top White House officials ahead of Mr. Trump's trip to Asia next month, one official said. But the reorganization is still a sign of a diminishing role for Mr. Navarro, who the president suggested in December would be given a post on par with that of Mr. Cohn. "I don't think there's an effort to marginalize Peter. I think there's an effort to marginalize President Trump's national strategy of putting America first," said Dan DeMicco, former senior trade advisor to the Trump campaign and chairman of the Coalition for a Prosperous America. "I think people have a lot to lose if the president succeeds, which I think he will, and they're fighting like tooth and nail to maintain the status quo." Mr. D'Amico, who supports the type of steel restrictions championed by Mr. Navarro, said he did not agree with the reorganization of Mr. Navarro's office, because Cohn was so anti the president's position on trade, he said. But that doesn't mean the president has given up on his positions. Mr. Navarro is now one of the few remaining advocates of a nationalist trade policy following the departures over the summer of Reince Priebus, Mr. Trump's first chief of staff, and Stephen K. Bannon, the chief strategist. Stephen Miller, Mr. Trump's senior advisor, and Mr. Lighthizer are now Mr. Navarro's primary allies on trade. Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross has also been an ally, particularly in pushing for tougher steel import restrictions. The power of the pro-trade advocates inside the White House suggests a willingness by Mr. Trump to back away, at least temporarily, from some of his harshest rhetoric from the campaign trail. They appear to have successfully convinced the president that trade deals can be used as leverage in broader conflicts with nations like North Korea and Mexico. Ripping them up would mean losing that potential advantage, the trade advocates have argued. White House officials say Mr. Trump still remains committed to ending trade agreements if they can't be renegotiated to his liking. But they say he has recognized that there is a need for a more considered approach as he is confronted by other domestic and international issues, like North Korea, illegal immigration and drug trafficking on the border with Mexico. Mr. Lighthizer has advanced a series of far-reaching proposals to revise NAFTA that are backed by Mr. Navarro and Mr. Ross. But Canadian and Mexican counterparts, as well as business groups, object to the provisions as non-starters. On Tuesday, the parties postponed the next round of talks until next month to give negotiators more time. Mr. Navarro would have preferred a more aggressive approach, officials said. A former Democratic candidate for San Diego mayor, a Ph.D. economist and a professor at the University of California, Irvine, he has views on trade that diverge with those of most economists, who generally agree that Americans are the better off under NAFTA. Mr. Navarro criticizes trade deals and trade deficits, saying the NAFTA agreement would be more properly called SHAFTA. In January, Mr. Navarro arrived at the White House with an already written order to ditch NAFTA. Although it would not have ended the trade deal immediately, it allowed time to negotiate a better pact or withdraw by the end of 2017. Mr. Cohn objected to the move. In April, the parties clashed more publicly as Mr. Navarro pushed for issuing a NAFTA withdrawal notice on Mr. Trump's 100th day in office, over the objection of Mr. Cohn and other officials. White House advisors lit up phone lines to Capitol Hill and business groups, warning that an announcement was imminent. The President of Mexico and the Prime Minister of Canada called Mr. Trump to caution against such a precipitous step, and Mr. Trump backed down. "I decided rather than terminating NAFTA, which would be a pretty big, shock to the system, we will renegotiate," Mr. Trump told reporters. Mr. Navarro and Mr. Cohn have also clashed over twin investigations the White House launched in April into whether steel and aluminum imports pose a threat to national security. Mr. Navarro, along with Mr. Ross, became a driving force for the effort, which would have allowed the president to impose sweeping tariffs on imported metal. But Mr. Cohn, Mr. Mnuchin and others were concerned about the impact on steel-consuming industries in the United States, which would likely see their prices rise as a result. They were also worried about foreign allies that export steel to the United States, who threatened a trade war in response. The internal divisions are now spilling out into public. On Tuesday, The Washington Post reported on a two-page document that Mr. Navarro wrote and circulated, pegging the decline of American manufacturing to an increase in abortion, spousal abuse, divorce and infertility. One official, who spoke on the condition of anonymity, said the leak of the document was viewed as an attempt to undercut Mr. Navarro at a time of growing trade tensions. "Navarro seems intent on implementing the trade policies Trump campaigned on," said Lori Wallach, director of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch. "But there clearly are some in the administration who oppose Trump's approach, and given they can't attack Trump or his agenda, they go after Navarro." Several economists said well-founded research has pointed to a stronger link between international trade, a decline in manufacturing, and certain social effects, including a rise in drug abuse and suicides, and a decline in employment, the marriage rate and fertility. Separate research has also linked heavy job losses with declining birth rates and rising abortions. David Autor, a professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the author of some of the research, said the document had some factual basis, though he said he did not view ripping up trade deals as the answer. When areas lose a lot of jobs, not surprisingly, people tend to go off the rails, said Mr. Autor. This is not saying this is the effect of NAFTA. Jason Furman, the former chief economic advisor to President Barack Obama, said he disagrees with the Trump administration on what has caused the loss of manufacturing jobs, but he wouldn't laughingly dismiss the idea that manufacturing job loss doesn't have lots of harmful consequences. Mr. Furman said, "I think the evidence is that it does.